My teaching practices that I was able to implement over the last year have to do with 3 classes. And Marti is a component in the class. He's not the focus of the class, but it's a really important segue into students really expanding the horizons of what it means to have experienced Spanish history from the lens of Spain, but also from the Americas. And so the classes are the Generation of 98 taught in Spanish, which is, I have a section that's an undergraduate and then a graduate level. So 1 semester and then the other. And then also I was a guest lecturer for 1 night in a class that's called Cuba, a Collective Portrait, taught by 2 colleagues of mine in English. And in this class, students learn about Cuban history, the life in Cuba, and then they spend a week in Cuba during spring break. It's an upper level class for Latin American students, Latin American studies students. So then my goal in presenting this information is to decenter the narrative that puts Spain mid-center, in the middle of the viewpoint of students, especially if you look at canonical literature in the classes that I teach. And so I'm inviting students to think about how they can experience the relationship between Spain and Cuba. And just to give you one example, I have them focus on the connection between the revolution of 1868 that resulted in the dethronement of Isabel II, and then how did that influence the beginning of the 10 Years' War? And they come to the conclusions, or they begin to understand a little bit better how the political chaos and moment of tumult in Spain at that time opened up avenues, not just for this 10 Years' War, but then for also expansion in architecture or in the construction of roadways in Spain. I pull in some video, and they are able to see after the provisional government, after the dethronement of Isabel II, the king who was named from Italy, Amadeo de Saboya, Amadeo I. Well, I asked students after viewing the video to summarize the problems that he encountered, and among those would be the independence movements in Cuba, among other things that were happening in Spain, workers, rioting, uprisings and such, the clash between clergy and government, just a lot of political turmoil that was happening. And so what begins to emerge then is this idea of how events happening in both areas related to one another. And so that's really my goal in presenting this, so that it's not so one-sided presenting of what happened in Spain. So students in all of the classes read My Race, Mi Raza, as published in Patria, 1893. But I want to note here that when I present this in the course that's taught in English, there is, because it's read in translation, I use this quote from Brown University Center for Digital Scholarship to explain the terminology of how Negroes is used. And I use that as in the quotation phrasing here, because in today's political climate, my hope is that students begin to think about this concept in what is going on in today's world, today's society. Although that's not something that we overtly talk about, I know that it's something that my students have very present in their minds. So you'll see the course, in this part of the course, it's discussion based. I follow a modification of some of the questions that I took away from the Institute. Thank you, James. And the one thing that I was particularly interested in for my own teaching is the connection of the readings with the construction of race and with construction of gender. And I wanted to point you to the last question: to what degree, whether implicitly or explicitly, do women play a role in this essay? And I'm really fascinated by the students' responses, because some say, no, there's really not a mention of women. Some say, well, the mention of women is in a despective or in a negative connotation. But then there are others who really will pull in the idea of gender by expanding on the definition of hombre or man to mean mankind or humankind. And so I'm really interested, and that sparks some discussion of what is meant by gender and how does Marti, in their interpretation of that, draw in the idea of women. I also had them read Manifiesto de Montecristi, and I have them look at key words and phrases, the betterment and emancipation of the country, fully constituted republic. I also draw their attention to how the word republic is being used and what republic means, especially in Spain, when the term republic is really for those who are of the conservative bent, will look at this as something extremely negative. So republic, you know, the idea of representation in government, the voice of the people, this resolve of solid men, concept of race, and concept of patria. So students are continuously being asked to think about these ideas as they relate to both areas. And I really want to emphasize too that I want my students not to look at Spain as just this other area across the Atlantic Ocean. I want them to know that there are connections to be drawn, and I invite them to draw those connections. And then with the class, the Cuba A Collective Portrait, one of the things that I'm going to be repeating this lecture in just a couple of weeks, and I found that this framework that I took away from the institute that I followed from James's presentation, who is José Marti, and the idea that what the students at my university will mainly know on the whole is that he wrote some poetry, that he maybe wrote some essays, but the idea of chronicler, teacher, poet, and revolutionary, it really gives the students a chance to see that he was so much more. And this is something that we found during the Institute. You just really can't finish describing the depth and magnitude of who Marti really is and was. And so I really will be following this framework again. I found that it worked really well to help them expand on how they view him. So I start that lecture with a brief biographical description, and I break down the timeline of what happened in his life and focusing more on what he accomplished as far as in his writing and in his political endeavors. And then I'd just like to pull out this quote: "I defend only what I consider a guarantee of or a service to the revolution. I know how to disappear, but my thoughts will never disappear, nor will my obscurity leave me embittered. The moment will take shape. We will proceed." So that's all I have for you today. Thank you.